She was 19 years old, and she had nothing left. The man who had taken everything from her was named Harlan Dryce, her late father's business partner, a man who had smiled warmly at the graveside and then, within a fortnight of the burial, had produced a set of documents that no 19-year-old girl in the autumn of 1887 could easily contest. The documents said the ferry operation on the Calloway River belonged to him now, every rope and plank and schedule, every coin that the crossing earned on market days. He had handed her $14 and told her she ought to be grateful. She took the money because she had no other choice, and she walked out of the only home she had ever known into the gray October morning with a traveling bag that held 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and a small tin of dried herbs her grandmother had taught her to keep close. $14. That was all. Then, on a Tuesday morning that smelled of river mud and coming frost, a county auction was held down at the southern landing of Grover's Crossing, Missouri. Nobody wanted the derelict ferry barge that sat half-submerged against the cutbank, a wide, flat-bottomed hull that had not moved under its own ropes in 3 years, waterlogged and listing and growing a green beard of moss along its lower strakes. The auctioneer called the opening bid twice. Nobody raised a hand. He called it a 3rd time, and a young woman in a brown wool coat stepped forward and paid $6 for it, which left her with 8, which most of the men on that landing considered a pure act of desperation or madness or both. What none of those men could have known, what the girl herself could not yet have suspected, was that, inside the sealed forward cuddy of that rotting hull, wedged beneath a rotted floorboard that had swollen so tightly it had held against every flood and every winter, lay something that had been hidden there for 22 years. Something that would not merely change one young woman's fortune. It would give an entire town back the name that had been stolen from it, and expose a wrong so old and so deep that the roots of it had grown into the very courthouse records of Calloway County. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Vess. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a place others have written off, tell us about it in the comments below, because this story is for you. Nora's people had come to the Calloway River Valley in the year her grandfather was 43 and full of purpose. His name was Edmund Vess, and he had arrived in Missouri from eastern Tennessee with 2 mules, a broadaxe, a wife named Cora, and the singular conviction that where a river narrowed between 2 limestone bluffs there was always, sooner or later, commerce. He was right. The crossing at what would become Grover's Crossing was only 40 yards wide at that particular neck of the river, and the current was manageable 9 months out of 12, and the road that connected the grain farms on the east bank to the mill town of Hatchfield on the west happened to pass directly through that neck. Edmund Vess built a raft, then a proper flat-bottomed barge, then a second one, and then, when his son Thomas came of age, they built a low wooden dock on each bank and hung a rope system between them so the crossing could be made in 12 minutes in any weather a man could stand upright in. Thomas Vess, Nora's father, had expanded the operation in the way quiet, steady men do, without fanfare, without borrowing, and without ever treating the river as something to be conquered rather than respected. He added a small freight service, and on Saturday mornings, when farm families came from 20 miles in every direction to trade at Hatchfield Market, the Vess barge carried chickens in crates and sacks of cornmeal and sometimes a small piano that had come by mail order and needed to reach someone's front parlor before Christmas. The business was modest by any grand measure, but it was honest and it was solvent and it was theirs. Nora had grown up on the river the way children raised near water always do, with an Intimacy for its moods that other people found unnerving. She could read the color of the current and tell you whether rain had fallen in the hill country to the north 2 days ago. She could feel a change in the pull of the rope and know before any instrument confirmed it that the water was rising. Her father had taught her everything he knew about the operation, how to read a rope for wear, how to patch a whole plank with oakum and pine pitch, how to manage the accounting ledger in a hand neat enough that any county clerk would accept it. He had not done this with any particular philosophical agenda. He had simply needed help, and Nora was there, and she was better at most of it than he was, and they both knew it. Her mother, Clara, had died of a fever when Nora was 11, and after that it was just the two of them, father and daughter, living in the small frame house on the East Bank, cooking simple suppers and reading aloud to each other in the evenings from whatever book the lending circuit brought around. Nora had developed, in those quiet years, a quality that is harder to name than intelligence, a kind of patient, structural attention to the world around her, an ability to see what a thing actually was rather than what it appeared to be. It would serve her. She did not yet know how much. Her father had taken on Harlan Dryce as a minor partner 3 years before he died. When a particularly bad spring flood had damaged the East Dock badly enough that repair costs strained the operation's savings. Dryce was a land speculator from Hatchfield with smooth hands and a quality of agreeable attentiveness that Nora had mistrusted from the first afternoon she had shaken his hand. He had contributed $400 to the repairs in exchange for a 1/4 share of the Ferry income, and Thomas Vess had shaken hands on it over the kitchen table while Nora stood in the doorway and felt something she could not quite articulate settle like cold water in the base of her stomach. She had learned early that the things she could not articulate were often the most important things, and she had made herself pay attention to Dryce in the months that followed, the way he asked questions about the accounts that were too precise to be casual, the way he spoke about the Calloway River Valley in terms of what it might become rather than what it was, the way he looked at the ferry dock not with the warmth of a man who has invested in something he believes in, but with the measuring eye of a man who is calculating what the thing is worth when it belongs to him entirely. Her father had not seen it. Thomas Vess was a man whose trust, once extended, was very difficult to retrieve. It was perhaps his finest quality and his most costly one. He died in the March of 1887, of a congestion of the lungs. That came on fast and left him no time to settle his affairs beyond dictating a short letter to Nora that she kept pressed inside her mother's Bible. The letter said he loved her and that the ferry and the house and everything in it was hers by right of blood and work. The letter was not a legal instrument. Harlan Dryce appeared 12 days after the funeral with a document that said otherwise, a partnership agreement that Thomas Vess had apparently signed in the autumn of 1885, before the business recovery was complete, which stipulated that upon the death of either partner, the surviving partner assumed full operational control and ownership of all assets including the Real property on both banks of the river. The document had been witnessed and notarized by a clerk in Hatchfield named Orrin Buell, who happened to be Dryce's second cousin by marriage, though that fact did not appear on any document in any office. Nora had looked at the papers for a long time. She had read every line. She had asked Dryce, very quietly, whether her father had understood what he was signing. Dryce had smiled at her in the way that men who have already won sometimes smile at those they have defeated, with a kind of performed sadness that is really triumph wearing a costume. He told her that her father had been a fine man, and that he regretted this was how things had worked out, and that $14 was more than he was strictly obligated to offer, and that she was young and capable and would surely land on her feet. She left without another word. She did not cry until she reached the road, and even then she kept walking while she did it. The months that followed were the most difficult of Nora Vess's life, and she had not, by any measure, lived an easy one. She found work in Hatchfield as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Aldous Crane, who paid her fairly but whose shop was cold in winter and whose register smelled of camphor and old wood. She slept in a rented room above the hardware store and ate supper at a boarding house on Meridian Street and saved every cent she could, which was not many cents, because the work was intermittent and the winter of 1887 was harder than most. She wrote to the county clerk about her father's estate. She was told the documents were in order. She wrote again and was told the same. She did not have the money for a lawyer, and the one attorney in Grover's Crossing had been known to take his lunches with Harlan Dryce. She did not stop thinking. That was the one thing they could not take from her. She turned the situation over in her mind. The way her hands might turn a river stone, looking for the edge that was different from the others, the rough place that meant the stone had a story. She did not know what she was looking for. She knew only that she needed something, a thread, a seam, a record that contradicted the record Dryce had produced. She had not found it yet. But she had not stopped looking. It was the October auction that changed the direction of her search, though she did not know it in those terms when she walked down to the southern landing on that Tuesday morning. She had heard about the auction from Aldous Crane, who had heard about it from the notice posted at the courthouse, and she had gone partly from habit. Vess women had always attended auctions on the river, and partly from something less definable, a pull that she had learned over 19 years not to dismiss. The barge that sat against the cutbank was called, according to the county's asset list, the Rewrote. She knew that name. It had been her grandfather Edmund's second ferry, the one he had retired in the early 1860s when the new barge was built. She had heard her father speak of it occasionally. It had sat on this bank for decades, slowly settling, too solid to sink entirely but too far gone to be worth repairing. 3 years ago, the county had annexed it as an unclaimed nuisance. Now they were trying to be rid of it. Nora looked at it for a long time before the auctioneer called the opening bid. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, carefully, structurally, without sentiment but not without feeling. The hull was wide and still, basically intact despite the waterlogging. The listing was not catastrophic. The barge had settled into the mud at a stable angle. The upper deck was rotten but the lower strakes, the deep belly of the hull, looked as though they had been built from the heartwood of a very old tree that had not yet given up its density. She was not thinking about what the barge was worth. She was thinking about her grandfather, who had built it, and about the fact that this was the last thing in the county that bore the Vess name in any form, Rewrote having been Edmund's phonetic rendering of his mother's maiden name, Meret, and about the fact that standing here in this cold morning air, she had $8 left in the world and nobody was bidding. $6, she offered. She spent the rest of that Tuesday and all of Wednesday simply being with the barge, the way you have to be with a thing before you can know it. She waded out in her boots and pressed her palms against the hull planks, feeling for what was solid and what was not. She found more solid than she expected. The pitch and oakum seal along the lower strakes had held remarkably well. Her grandfather had done his sealing work as seriously as he had done everything else, and the worst of the rot was confined to the upper deck planking, which was essentially ornamental on a working ferry barge. The rope cleats were rusted, but the iron of them was still sound. She was moving along the forward section of the hull, below the waterline, pushing her hand along the underside of the interior floor. The hull was raised just enough on the mud that she could work her fingers into the space, when she felt it. A plank different from the others. Wider. With a deliberate edge to its seating, as though it had been fitted to be removed. She had spent enough of her childhood watching her father and grandfather work on hulls to know the difference between a plank that had swollen tight by accident and a plank that had been designed to be tight from the beginning, sealed with intention, rather than by the slow work of decades. This plank had been placed that way. Someone had put it there to hold. She had no tools with her that afternoon. She came back the next morning with a flat-blade chisel and a wooden mallet she had borrowed from Aldous Crane's storage room, and she worked at the edge of the plank for the better part of an hour in the cold morning air, her breath clouding in front of her, her fingers going numb and then finding warmth again in the work itself. The plank did not want to give, but she was patient and methodical, and eventually it gave. What she found beneath it was wrapped in a length of oilcloth that had kept so well it might have been sealed last month rather than, as she would later determine, in the autumn of 1865, there was a packet of papers. A leather-bound ledger no larger than her hand. And a small tin box, the kind that might have held tobacco, sealed shut with a strip of wax that had dried and hardened into a perfect amber collar. She sat in the cold mud of the riverbank with these things in her lap and did not open them immediately. She Saturday with them the way she had learned to sit with things that mattered, giving herself a moment to understand that whatever was in her hands was going to be important. She did not know how important. She would find out. The papers were letters, 3 of them, written in a hand she recognized after a moment's study as her grandfather Edmund's, though an earlier version of it, younger and more urgent than the firm clear script she knew from the ledger books her father had kept. The letters were addressed to a man named Calloway, Silas Calloway, and they were dated between August and November of 1865. The name Calloway she knew as the name of the river, which had been named, she had always been told, for an early trapper. But these letters addressed Silas Calloway as a business partner, as the man who had co-founded the ferry crossing, as the man who owned the eastern quarter of the land on which the crossing sat, land that Edmund Vess had always paid him a share from, according to figures recorded in the letters with the same careful precision her grandfather had brought to everything. The letters spoke of a dispute, of a document Silas Calloway had prepared and asked Edmund Vess to sign, transferring Calloway's share of the land to a joint holding to be managed by both families in perpetuity. Of Edmund's agreement and his intention to register the transfer with the county that winter. The final letter, dated November 12, 1865, spoke of something else. It spoke of Silas Calloway's sudden illness. Of his fear that his brother, a man named Porter Calloway who lived in St. Louis and who had never contributed a day's work to anything on the river, would arrive and claim everything. Of his request, in language that grew increasingly urgent toward the close, that Edmund Vess take the joint transfer document and the ledger, recording all previous shared earnings, and hide them somewhere. Porter Calloway could not find them, until Silas recovered or until the right time came to present them to someone with the authority to enforce them. Silas Calloway had not recovered. He had died in December of 1865, and Porter Calloway had arrived from St. Louis and had claimed the eastern land, and Edmund Vess, facing a legal contest he could not afford and a community that had not yet organized itself well enough to stand behind him, had apparently made the decision not to surface the hidden documents, calculating, perhaps, that the moment was not right, that Porter Calloway's claim would sort itself, that the time would come. The time had not come. Edmund had grown old and the documents had stayed where he had put them, below the floor of the retired barge he had built with his own hands, and then Edmund had died and the knowledge of them had gone with him. Until now. Nora opened the ledger with fingers that were trembling slightly, not from cold. The ledger was a record of the Vess Calloway Ferry earnings from 1849 through 1864. Kept in 2 columns. Edmund Vess's share on the left, Silas Calloway's share on the right. In a hand that alternated between her grandfather's and another, rounder script that she understood after a moment must be Silas Calloway's own. There were notes in the margins, notations about the river, about repairs, about the seasons. There was one entry, in the margin of the September 1864 page, in Silas Calloway's hand, that said simply, built. This with Ed, River will remember even if men do not. The tin box held a single-folded document. It was the land transfer Silas Calloway had mentioned in his last letter, a formal, properly worded conveyance of the eastern quarter of the Calloway River crossing lands from sole ownership by Silas Calloway to joint ownership, in equal shares, by the Vess family and the Calloway family, in perpetuity, to be held in trust for the operation of the river crossing in service of the community of Grover's Crossing and its surrounding farms. It was signed by Silas Calloway. It was signed by Edmund Vess. It was witnessed by 2 names she did not recognize. And in the corner, in faded but legible ink, it bore a date stamp from the Hatchfield Land Office, dated October 3, 1865. Meaning it had been registered before Silas Calloway's illness, before Porter Calloway's arrival, before any of the subsequent claims. It had been registered and then apparently buried so thoroughly in the county's own archive that no one had found it in 22 years, or perhaps. And this thought arrived in Nora's mind with a cold precision, no one had looked. She sat with all of this for a long time. The river moved past her at its own pace, indifferent and constant. A heron landed on the far bank and stood in the shallows with its particular ancient patience. The morning light came through the cottonwood trees in long, pale shafts, and Nora Vess, 19 years old and possessed of $8 and a rotting barge, held in her lap a document that said the land under the Calloway River crossing, the land that Harlan Dryce had claimed through her father's signature, was not entirely his to claim, had never been entirely anyone's to claim alone, because it had been jointly deeded in trust for the community more than 2 decades ago, and that deed had been filed with the county, which meant it was still, technically, legally, irrevocably in effect. She understood it before she fully understood it, the way you sometimes understand a thing in the body before the mind has assembled all the words for it. She stood up from the mud of the riverbank. She carefully rewrapped the documents in the oilcloth. She tucked them inside her coat, against her chest. And she began walking toward Hatchfield. It took 3 days and cost her 4 of her remaining dollars, for a night at the boarding house, for a consultation with an attorney named Theodore Greer who practiced in the larger town of Mills Point, 18 miles up the road, and who had no connection to Harlan Dryce or to the county politics of Grover's Crossing. She laid the documents on Theodore Greer's desk and let him read them while she sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her face perfectly composed. Greer was a careful man, a thorough man. He read everything twice. He asked her where she had found them and she told him. He asked whether she understood the implications and she said she believed she did. He told her the county land registration stamp on the transfer document was genuine, he had seen enough of them to know, and that the joint trust deed, if it had truly been filed in October of 1865 and was in the county record, superseded any subsequent individual claim to that land, including any claim that derived from a partnership agreement signed by a single party who may not have had full authority to convey land held in community trust. She asked him, very calmly, what he thought Harlan Dryce's position would be once this was established. Greer leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a moment. Then he said that Dryce's position would be that of a man who had represented himself as the sole owner of something he did not solely own, and had collected income accordingly, and that in the eyes of the law this would be a matter of some consequence. Nora nodded. She told him to proceed. What followed was not fast. The law is never fast, and 1887 is not a year in which young women without money or political standing moved through legal processes without friction. Dryce had lawyers, and he used them. He challenged the authenticity of the documents. He claimed the land office stamp had been forged. He argued that the passage of 22 years and the failure of any Calloway heir to assert the trust deed constituted effective abandonment. Each argument cost him something: money, time, and, most importantly, the increasingly undivided attention of the community of Grover's Crossing, which began to understand, as the weeks passed and the newspaper in Mills Point carried the story, what had actually been sitting in that county archive for 2 decades and why nobody in the county clerk's office had ever thought to mention it. The community had, as communities sometimes do when they feel they have been made foolish by the deliberate opacity of powerful men, a reaction that was quiet and total. Farmers who had been taking their grain to Hatchfield Market on Dryce Ferry found reasons to wait until Saturday and see how the legal matter sorted itself. The Merchant Association in Hatchfield sent a letter to the county commission expressing concern about the title situation. A Calloway descendant, Silas's granddaughter, a widow named Margaret Pruitt who lived in Jefferson City, was located by Theodore Greer and arrived in Grover's Crossing in December wearing a black traveling coat and an expression of sustained fury that she had apparently been nursing for most of her adult life, having always believed that something irregular had happened when her grandfather died, and finding now that she was correct. Harlan Dryce left Grover's Crossing in February of 1888. He did not leave in disgrace, exactly, the law is cautious about such language, but he left having signed a settlement that restored the joint trust deed to active legal status, returned a substantial sum to both the Vess estate and the Calloway Pruitt estate in recognition of improperly collected revenue, and transferred operational control of the ferry crossing to a community board of which Nora Vess was named founding director, in accordance with the original trust language, which specified that management should rest with the family most continuously engaged in the crossing's daily operation. The house on the east bank came back to Nora with it. She stood in the front room on the morning she returned to it and looked at the familiar angles of the ceiling and the familiar smell of river damp and pine wood, and felt something she was careful not to call victory, because it did not feel like victory. Exactly. It felt more like the way a river feels when a logjam finally clears, not triumphant, but restored to its proper direction. She spent the spring of 1888 doing 2 things simultaneously, working with a local boat builder named Henry Cass to rehabilitate the River Mairead, her grandfather's old barge, and working with Margaret Pruitt and a committee of local families to draft a formal charter for the Grover's Crossing Community Ferry Trust. The charter established that the crossing would be operated in perpetuity as a community service, with fares set at a level that covered maintenance and wages but did not extract profit for any private individual, and with a board of directors drawn from the farming families on both banks who depended on the crossing for their livelihoods. It also established a small archive, housed in a room of the East Bank Dock Building, where the original Vess Calloway ledger, the letters, and the land transfer document were preserved under glass, so that the people of Grover's Crossing and their children and their children's children could see the record of what the river had been built on, and what it had cost, and what it had taken to restore it. The River Marate, once she and Henry Cass had finished with her, was not beautiful in any conventional sense. She was a flat-bottomed workhorse of a vessel, wide and deliberate and without any pretension. But she was sound. The hull that Edmund Vess had built with his broadaxe and his conviction had been built to last, and it had lasted, and when Nora guided her out of the dock on the first morning of public service, the old barge moved across the Calloway River with a slow, unhurried dignity that made something tighten in the throats of the people who had gathered on both banks to watch. Margaret Pruitt was there. Henry Cass was there. Theodore Greer had made the trip from Mills Point. Aldous Crane, who had given Nora the bookkeeping work and the borrowed chisel, and had never asked for either back, stood on the East Bank with his hat in his hand. The families from the East Bank farms were there, the Bellers and the Kinnaw and the Mossett family with their 4 children, who were too young to understand entirely what they were watching but who would remember it anyway, the way children remember the serious moments of adults, in the body rather than the mind. Nora stood at the ferry rope in her brown wool coat, her hands in their familiar position, and brought the River Marate across the Calloway River in the morning light. And the water moved beneath them as it had always moved, unhurried and unconquerable and full of the memory of everyone who had ever depended on it. We think about Nora Vess sometimes, when we find ourselves standing in front of something old and waterlogged and apparently worthless, something that the world has passed over and left to the mud. We think about what she saw when she looked at that barge, not what it appeared to be, which was wreckage, but what it was, which was a structure her grandfather had built honestly and with intention, and which had held, even submerged, even listing, even green with the accumulated patience of decades, because good construction does not stop being good construction just because no one is paying attention to it. She was 19 years old, and she had nothing left, and she paid $6 for a waterlogged hull that every other person on that landing had decided was worth nothing, and inside it she found a document that was worth the future of an entire community. But we think the more interesting truth is this: she only found it because she looked. She looked because she had learned, in a childhood spent on a working river with a father who took things seriously, that the thing in front of you is usually telling you something if you are willing to be quiet enough to hear it. She had nothing except that quality, that patient structural attention, and it turned out to be the only thing she needed. The River Marate ran the Calloway crossing for another 11 years, until a proper bridge was built downstream in 1899 and the ferry service was retired. By then the Community Trust had accumulated enough in reserve to fund the bridge's construction without a single outside loan, which was something the county commissioner mentioned in his dedication speech, perhaps without understanding fully why the people of Grover's Crossing smiled at each other when he said it. The River Marate was not scrapped. She was drawn up onto the east bank and allowed to rest there, and in time the grass grew around her and the cottonwood trees provided shade, and she became the kind of landmark that people in a small town point to when they are trying to explain to a newcomer who they are and where they come from. Children played on her in the summers. On the 20th anniversary of the Trust's founding, a small bronze plate was fixed to her bow, engraved with the names Edmund Vess and Silas Calloway, and below them, the names of the families who had worked the crossing across the decades, and at the bottom, in letters the same size as all the others, the name Nora Vess, and the year 1887, and 4 words, she looked. She held. And we think that is about as fine a thing as can be said about a person. That when everything was taken, she held. That when the world offered her wreckage at a price no one else would pay, she saw what was inside it. That she used what she found not to make herself powerful but to make her community whole. That is the quiet revolution of it. That is what we come back to, every time we tell this story. Settle in and remember it, the way the river remembers, not loudly, not with a great rushing claim upon the record, but steadily, and without forgetting, and for a very long time. We are so glad you spent this time with us today, and we mean that with complete sincerity. Stories like Nora's do not exist to entertain us in the easy sense, they exist to remind us of something we already know but sometimes need to hear again, which is that overlooked things carry their value whether or not anyone is looking, and that the people willing to look are the ones who change the shape of the future. If this story moved you, we would love it if you shared it with someone who could use a reminder of that today. And we have one question we want to leave you with, because we think it is worth sitting with. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something, or someone, that the world had written off? We would love to read your answers in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.